Zero COVID policies continue to spring up dissension among Shanghai and Beijing residents. Some have already forcibly disappeared or were arrested. Do these new protests paint a new future for Chinese citizens? An unlikely organization is now calling for an official investigation into the origins of COVID-19, and the Chinese Communist Party is not happy about it. Attacks on women have risen sharply over the last several years, and one viral Chinese social media video has many calling for justice. For all that, what will the UN High Commissioner do after her failed trip to China? Welcome back to another episode of the Bob Fu Report. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Dingler, bringing you pressing updates from China concerning human rights, religious freedom, and rule of law. Welcome back again. Last episode, we covered the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights' failed trip to China. The former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, ended her visit with an egregious statement. Not only did she fail to condemn any of the numerous crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, but she also betrayed Uyghurs, Christians, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, and countless prisoners of conscience. Her trip was completely managed and monitored by the Chinese Communist Party in a closed loop. Other human rights organizations and the U.S. State Department begged for her not to go on the trip due to China's involvement. But she didn't heed any of our advice. Her trip accomplished nothing for the sake of human rights, and other organizations, including China Aid, are livid. In fact, over 230 of them called for her resignation last week. Well, she made a statement recently about her trip and announced that she will not run a second time for High Commissioner of Human Rights. Perhaps she ended up getting a new job with the Chinese Communist Party in their propaganda committee or any of their other truth ministries. In all seriousness, she claims her trip to China has nothing to do with this announcement, even though she only made the announcement after supposedly notifying relevant officials and receiving her justifiable backlash. Despite the announcement, there are still concerns as to whether or not she and her office will ever release their report on Xinjiang, a report that was actually promised months ago. She does not seek a second term, but isn't she still obligated to release her findings? Kenneth Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, appears to think so in a recent tweet. Quote, Michelle Bachelet's decision not to seek a second term should not stand in the way of her duty to complete the tasks of her first term, including prompt publication of her long-delayed report on the Chinese government's crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. Zero COVID has forced Shanghai and Beijing back into high alert for COVID-19. On June 9th, parts of China's largest economic hub imposed new lockdown restrictions as thousands of coronavirus testing sites appeared overnight. These lines are miles long, which somehow doesn't break social distancing rules, and citizens sometimes are only able to test in select windows. As ABC reported, Guo Yanghong, an official with the National Health Commission, said, quote, we must adhere to the strategy of expanding prevention centered on nucleic acid testing so as to control the epidemic earlier and faster. Some Shanghai citizens seem at peace about the lockdown because, well, maybe they're not affected, but Chinese social media paints a different picture altogether. Posts indicate that many of them just want to go back to living normal lives. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping and the communist regime have no interest in backing down, and instead reaffirming their zero COVID stance. They did this back in May, and last week, Xi Jinping did so again. Suffice to say, the rest of the world is still at odds with these policies. We all watched millions of people suffer for 2 months as the CCP tore apart families and countless Shanghai residents committed suicide or starved to death in their homes. Now they want to place one of Shanghai's biggest districts back into quarantine? It's absolutely absurd. And it seems some Shanghai residents could not take it anymore. As reported by a China Aid special correspondent, a protest broke out among residents of a lockdown neighborhood. Changle Road and 4 other streets in its vicinity were included in the Shanghai health officials' newly implemented lockdown restrictions. So they had a group of protesters who then questioned police with one person shouting, "Freedom, equity, democracy, rule of law," and suddenly an altercation broke out after many of them flipped off the police. Officers ended up arresting 2 of the residents, giving one a 10-day detention, and 2 reporters suddenly went missing after the scuffle. An older resident commented on the demonstration, quote, "It would be hopeless if nobody spoke up. A prison can hold 10,000 people, but it cannot hold 1,000,000. A recent report from Radio Free Asia indicates that China's zero-COVID policy could shift public opinion towards freedom, protests, and peaceful demonstrations. Last month, as you all know, students from several universities, including Beijing Normal University and Peking, protested at their respective schools. Impressively, these protests actually worked. The students were allowed to return home to finish their studies for the semester. The same was not true, however, for another group in Henan province. CNN reported a group that traveled to Henan's capital to protest a bank that froze their deposits. They planned the event in advance, but their efforts were foiled by the Chinese health app. This app indicates if the user has been exposed to COVID or any COVID areas. Green indicates no exposure, yellow indicates the possibility of exposure, and red demands an immediate quarantine. Unsurprisingly, the protesters all had a signal before the protest began, a red signal. This is just one of the many examples of such an instance. Human rights lawyers have previously received similar notices once they decide to represent individuals in cases, and some churches have faced similar accusations due to the health app. If Chinese citizens hope to protest their freedom, this will surely be a tactic that will be used against them. Speaking of protests, the anti-extradition protests in Hong Kong happened 3 years ago. Many Hong Kong exiles in the UK staged a commemoration for the 3-year anniversary. Some reported attendees hoped for independence for Hong Kong, others for armed resistance. But no matter their different aspirations, they all had one goal in common: more democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. Meanwhile, many in their hometown continue to suffer for the demonstrations 3 years ago. We're going to turn it over to our host, Bob Fu, to learn more. Bob?
Thank you, Jonathan, for that good update. Today, let's talk about the 3 years of Hong Kong crackdown. Remember the protest? It was started actually and sparked in 2019 when the so-called Hong Kong legislature, the pro-Beijing legislature, proposed legislation in 2019 for a Hong Kong extradition bill. According to that bill, it will make Hong Kong to extradite those from Chinese government. Any Hong Kong citizens will be subject for extradition. So this, of course, deeply angered the Hong Kong citizens. Remember, after the British handed over the Hong Kong to Communist China, one of the conditions was Hong Kong will keep a relatively independent judicial system, including the Hong Kong court has its final say on the judicial affairs for Hong Kong citizens by the Hong Kong court. And now, under this 2019 proposal of extradition law, basically the Hong Kong citizen would be handed over to the Chinese Communist system for trials, for the arrest, the interrogation, all these things. And we know, and the world know, and Hong Kong citizens know that inside China, it has a deeply flawed judicial system. No such thing called rule of law. It's rule by the law, or maybe to make it more simple, it's ruled by the man, by the Communist Party leaders' own will. So many of the suspects the Chinese Communist Party will seek from Hong Kong will be the Hong Kong the dissidents, the human rights activists, those who are protesting every year at Victoria Park in Hong Kong during the June 4th commemoration day. Hundreds of thousands. So these are going to be the targets. So that's why this new law will further, weaken the independence and autonomy of Hong Kong judicial system. And that's why it sparked the outrage. And it continued for months. Many of you have witnessed that. And, in 1984, when the former Communist Party military strongman Deng Xiaoping met with the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and signed that Hong Kong handover deal. It has a very clear principle in its clause in the handover toward 1997 on July 1st. That was the handover day. So it was registered in the United Nations, kind of as an insurance, as a formal treaty-like diplomatic agreement between two countries. So in that document, the Chinese Communist Party leader Deng Xiaoping and Party Secretary Zhao Ziyang and basically made a vow, a commitment, international covenant to keep the Hong Kong in a system called one country, two systems, which means, Hong Kong was technically regarded or taken over by China as part of China, Chinese territory, but China promised that the Hong Kong will continue its capitalist system, especially in the economic, in the judicial, educational autonomy. So with this proposed extradition law, this means the two systems commitment would be over, and the reality that happened afterward, and of course now we can tell that was exactly the intention of the Chinese Communist Party. Like my good friend, Dr. Sophia Richardson, the China director at Human Rights Watch, she said back to 2019, Dr. Richardson said, the proposed changes to the extradition laws will put anyone in Hong Kong doing work related to mainland China at risk. No one will be safe, including activists, human rights lawyers, journalists, and social workers. End the quote. So after that proposal was pronounced, countless Hong Kongers protested in the streets since June the 16th. An estimated 2 million Hong Kongers took to the streets in 2019. And young leaders such as Joshua Huang, Agnes Cho, and the just emerged leading the whole freedom moment in Hong Kong. And Joshua Huang actually was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize from 2017. And on July 1st, 2019, it was the anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to China, and it's also the Chinese Communist Party's birthday. So every year on July 1st, before that time, Hong Kongers would hold a peaceful protest. But that very year, in 2019, the protest shifted from the anti-extradition to also including the freedom, independent general elections in Hong Kong. Because for years, of course, the Hong Kong chief executive and other officials, especially those senior leaders, were pretty much picked by Beijing without any free, independent election. So this proposed extradition law make the Hong Kongers feel, worried that actually the whole Hong Kong's independence, and the system, the judicial and free system will be in jeopardy as well. So that, of course, prompted the Communist Party showed its true color. They began their violent crackdowns against these peaceful protesters since July 21st that year. And the whole world had been witnessing, and many even traveled there, including actually many U.S. citizens, because there are a large number of foreigners from the United Kingdom, from the U.S., Australia, Canada, had been staying in Hong Kong. Some, after this protest, many even traveled there to support the students, the peaceful protesters. And instead of having a peaceful dialogue with the protesters, and the Hong Kong authority certainly directly controlled and guided by the Chinese Communist Party leadership from Beijing, used the rubber bullets, tear gas, as Hong Kongers basically try to launch their protest, and some tearing down these face recognition cameras, and equip themselves with makeshift gas masks and umbrellas. So that was called the yellow umbrella moment, all the way to 2020. How did this conflict end? With the Communist Party, of course, sending militaries, the military police pretend to be Hong Kong police, and even start murdering its citizens, and immediately on the street, from university campuses, from the people's apartments, arresting them, took thousands into China. That without even the extradition law approved or implemented at all, the Communist Party just did it. Of course, the coronavirus, the Communist Party Wuhan virus, escalated in January 2020, and it partially halting the protests and gave Beijing, the Communist Party, the time and the circumstance to introduce this all-encompass, comprehensive, so-called the Hong Kong National Security Law that was passed on June 30th, 2020. So that law was implemented, of course, starting in July 1st, and then the Communist Party again revealed they don't care about freedom or judicial independence at all. And they basically set up a Hong Kong National Security Department, and basically full of the Chinese Communist Party cadres from China. And they're sending even the Communist Party loyalists to every school in Hong Kong. And all the dissidents had been either arrested or some fled out of Hong Kong. All the pro-democracy Hong Kong legislators who were elected but was de-elected, basically using the administrative measure, judicial measure, kick out of them. And some were called disqualified arbitrarily for not swear absolute loyalty oath to the Chinese Communist Party. And some Hong Kong conscience, the Cardinal Joseph Zen, and of course Joshua Huang, Agnes Cho, Martin Lee, many of them are dedicated Christians, Protestants and Catholics alike. And the Hong Kong, maybe the only dissident newspaper who speak up with the true voice for the reporting what's happening. The founder of Apple Daily, Jamie Lai, was also arrested and even sentenced to imprisonment. And after he came back from U.S., met with the White House senior officials in the State Department, met with then Secretary Mike Pompeo inside the State Department. So this Hong Kong conscience, they were all charged with this political charges, colluding with foreign forces, separation, all this kind of subversive of the state power, arbitrary. The political charges were imposed, and they were all sentenced, imprisoned. So this is happening, still happening today. And this year, the Hong Kong Communist Party leadership basically started arresting those peaceful protesters to commemorating the June 4th massacre nearby the Victoria Park. So that's the end of Hong Kong's freedom. I would urge you to continue to pray, to remember those who are in bond, as if we are bonded with them. Thank you.
Thank you for that report, Bob. The World Health Organization has urged scientists to continue studying the origin of COVID-19, especially in regard to the Wuhan lab leak theory. This was once dismissed by many as a conspiracy, but some experts and officials have started to take it a little bit more seriously. This is a quote from one of the Chinese officials. "The lab leak theory is totally a lie concocted by anti-China forces for political purposes, which has nothing to do with science." Again, that was Zhao Lian. He told that to a daily press briefing. He continued, "We always have supported and participated in science-based global virus tracing, but we firmly oppose any form of political manipulation." Meanwhile, though, the Chinese government has no problem throwing American laboratories under the bus. They have long blamed us for the virus contaminating food exports because of American scientists leaking it in a lab at an attempt of biological warfare. There's a lot of theories, but the fact remains that even if the leak from China was unintentional, it would be entirely possible for an accident to cause it. Some WHO officials admitted that in a report openly. Now, China aid sources believe the release was premeditated and intentional. As some of our anonymous sources have confirmed the existence of COVID-19 in Wuhan since before 2019. Spy agencies and scientists are still divided over the issue, and the World Health Organization stated that all theories are being carefully studied. Social media buzzed about a gruesome, brutal attack on women in Tangshan, Hebei province. 3 women minded their own business in a barbecue restaurant when a man touched one of their backs. She batted away some of his physical advances until he dragged her out into the street, breaking bottles and stomping on her head. Her friends tried to help, but the man's friends fended them off, beating them with chairs and furniture. The surveillance cameras caught the whole thing on tape, the whole altercation, and it was posted to Chinese social media like WeChat. Apparently, these attacks are common in Tangshan. Many women over the last year have faced similar violence after refusing sexual advances. The footage reminded them all too well about the chained woman case, a case that we've talked about here on this show. A woman went viral for being a victim of human trafficking in villages for several years. Now, interestingly, this outcry got a response from the authorities. Tangshan officials and authorities in nearby regions started to release public service announcements. Officers could stand in the middle of a street on what could only be envisioned as a soapbox, yelling through a megaphone, "Be nice to women! Do not hit them!" I mean, it's pretty bold for a Chinese official to tell citizens not to use violence against women when they, not so long ago, forced many of them to get abortions. Finally, for our last story today, the United States and China attended a summit in Shangri-La to dialogue about the issues clouding the U.S.-China relations. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that his meeting with China's defense minister was a key step to develop lines of communication between the two militaries. Although both sides say they want to better manage their relationship, Beijing and Washington remain ultimately polarized, namely on the Taiwan issue. We have President Biden, stuttering on whether or not he wants to militarily involve himself. And then let's also not forget that the CCP is not admitted to its crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. Now, it could have very well been a very beneficial summit, but Taiwan is the central issue here. Chinese Defense Minister General Hui Fenghe said, quote, "The People's Liberation Army would have no choice but to fight at any cost and crush any attempt of Taiwan independence, safeguarding national sovereignty and territorial integrity." Look, I don't know about you, but their position seems pretty clear to me. Let's continue to pray for our world leaders and for God to give them wisdom during these unpredictable times. Well, that concludes our broadcast for now. Be sure to check out ChinaAid's website at www.chinaid.org for more updates on persecuted Christians, rule of law, and human rights. God bless.